changed in the last 10 years or so. There are new sources of growth in the world, notably set in Africa. It is therefore important for us to review our perception of these exchanges, to go for a more global, more competitive, but also more prosperous and stable world based on strong regional consolidation. Indeed, the world crisis underway over the last few years has showed us that the best or worst practices in terms of economic policies are not just the precinct of a set of countries. In other words, the global development stage has changed accordingly. We're not just in a situation of donors and beneficiary countries. We are now working based on a rationale of partnership whereby everybody has to play their part to ensure a more sustainable and inclusive path to development. Secretary General, in this context, we keep a close eye on what's happening in the OECD, because the OECD is a major policy dialogue institution focusing on developing strategies for development that can be useful to the largest possible number of countries aside from its membership base. This forum is one of the opportunities whereby we can lay down the groundwork for fruitful exchanges between the OECD and Côte d'Ivoire. The Côte d'Ivoire is going to become a strong emerging economy, and for it to do so by 2020, we need your input. In terms of your input, I'm referring specifically to the Development Center. Now, this expertise could enable us to intensify the exchanges between developing countries in order to share best practices for an inclusive, sustainable, and lasting form of economic growth. Furthermore, Côte d'Ivoire, as a mid-revenue country, has undertaken a number of reforms to try to do away with the fetters to its development. We've focused on consolidating good governance, liberalizing the economic sector, liberalizing the business environment, promoting infrastructure and structural changes, notably focused on renewable energy resources. From this perspective, we see that the OECD has a unique perspective on analyzing the triggers for development. For a country like Côte d'Ivoire, we need to focus on building a proper and adequate business environment, but we need to do that bearing in mind the importance of endogenous and lasting development. In that regard, it's important to fight against climate change and ensure that we have social cohesion, because these are inextricably linked to the former. I'd like to congratulate the Secretary General for the choice of the themes focusing on economic development in Africa and the quality of the analysis coming from the report in the Economic Outlook for Africa. In that context, we can say that we have major challenges to face which have a tendency to hinder structural reform and the development of society. In order to be able to overcome these challenges, we need to strengthen our institutional capacity and our capacity for analysis. In this context, being able to pinpoint the obstacles to structural reform and being able to focus on strengthening our institutions would be one road to increasing our cooperation with the organization here. We also have to focus on improving our tax structures to ensure that we stabilize our tax revenue, all the while creating a fairer environment that incites that it acts as an incentive. We need to modernize and fundamentally overhaul our agricultural practices. We need to invest in human capital and thereby promote research and development in a number of different sectors. As Baudin was saying, wealth lies in human beings. I would like to once again focus on the excellent results in Africa in performance terms over the last few years. Africa is moving from being a hopeless continent to the continent of hope. And in that regard, it confirms the potential that it has to be a boost for growth into the future. This is my firm belief, and it is the belief of a number of Africans today. But it's also the belief of many public and private sector workers in the international field. What I'm saying is that Africa will be the new frontier of development in the decades to come. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. We have passed through the first phase, which was setting the scene. And now there is a question that we have to address, which is Africa in the new global economic landscape. That's the first step for our general discussion. Et pour cette raison, et pour la conduire.
And in order to have this discussion and enable it to be launched, I'll give the floor to Richard Attias, who is the president of the New York Forum Institute. Thank you, Mario. And ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you to our friends from the OECD for their welcome today. We met last time a year ago. In fact, we were at the same place last year, and some of you were here then and are here now. And I was thinking this morning that many things have happened in that last year. In Africa, a number of very positive developments, a more stabilized situation and a peace situation in Mali, a new president, Africa welcoming in the BRICS and Durban, notably the meeting in Durban in Africa this year, awareness on the need to protect animal species, for example, and in terms of the General Assembly and of the ADB, we talked about this in Marrakesh, and thanks to your initiative, not sooner than a couple of days ago where I was in London, we had a march bringing together thousands of people to focus on this absolute need to protect elephants in Africa. And then you have the Clinton Global Initiative undertaken in New York a number of days ago, which also focused on this issue. A number of taboo subjects that show that the continent is opening up as well. We have high-level diplomats coming back to Africa. The diaspora is changing flows. The new Chinese president who made his first trip to Africa and focused on 10 billion worth investment pledges. The President Obama, who has also focused on allocating a team to on setting up a team to focus on Africa, and then an organization that recognizes that Africa is now the best return on investment. That was last week, before Latin America. The UK, that has appointed a minister dealing with African affairs. The Brazil that goes to the Latin American African Summit, the African Development Fund that's set up by ADB, that again met 2 weeks ago, and this despite a tough economic climate. They managed to raise $7.3 billion. The Carlyle Fund as well, that's a huge investment fund that manages $180 billion, that has finally set up an Africa fund, and in the last 2 weeks, and in a couple of weeks, has raised $800,000. One of the managers of that fund was saying last week that out of the major contributors to this fund, there are many rich families that are waging on Africa. Gabon, Africa, Nigeria, Morocco have a number of sovereign funds as well that are more structural and structuring that economy. You have a Pan-African partnerships as well, and then countries which were former colonies, which are now seen as the El Dorado, the new El Dorado, for example, Portugal going to Mozambique and Angola because these are new lands for development, Spain coming back to Equatorial Guinea to invest there, and awareness then in terms of governments realizing the need to develop a proper diversification of their economy. All of these things are great, but there is a but. Let's not be too idealistic or utopian in our perspectives. Terrorism is still alive in Africa. It has to be eradicated. We're all thinking of the Kenyan tragedy. You can see as well with the tragic events that happened in terms of migratory outflows, what happened in the shipwreck off the Italian coast recently, the role of women in society, the importance of ensuring stability in a number of North African countries, and then infrastructure problems as well, which mean that many cities still have no running water or electricity, and all of these issues have to be addressed. Unless we had forgotten, I can see that with Twitter, that's incredibly active. In fact, it would take us about a day to deal with all of these issues. There is another fundamental issue, which is the issue of employment for young people. So we're going to be talking about all of these aspects that you will raise on Twitter or through other lines of questioning. And the aim is to have a frank and open discussion. We have Daniel Kaberuka, who is on his second term for the African Development Bank, former Minister of Finance and Planning in Rwanda. He's known for his exemplary management, which needs to be welcomed. Angel Gurria, who is the Secretary General of the OECD since 2006, who is Mexican, as he mentioned earlier, and he is the former Minister of Finance and Foreign Affairs. So again, he knows well what he's talking about. The Prime Minister from Côte d'Ivoire, who will stay with us throughout this debate, and he's also he's the right arm, if you like, of President Ouattara, who is carrying out so many changes in Africa, and Carlos Lopez, who I didn't know and who I've met today for the first time, but I really admire him for his courage, his commitment, and dedication to Africa. His father was imprisoned for having supported the independence of his country, Guinea-Bissau. He is Mr. Africa in terms of the United Nations. He spent 25 years within the UNDP. In Libreville, in last June, President Ouattara declared that Africa had a better entry into the 21st century than the stage it left of the 20th. What do you think of that? Well, I imagine that you don't expect me to say the opposite. I think he was right to say that. Félix Houphouët-Boigny, who was the first president of Côte d'Ivoire, stated that although Africa may have missed the Industrial Revolution, it should not miss the Information Revolution. And he died in 1993, so it was early days. He had a very strong vision for Africa in general and for Côte d'Ivoire in particular. Alassane Ouattara is following in this path. I actually think that there is much stronger awareness now in terms of the need to move forward fast and efficiently, following the tracks of Asia and Latin America, but essentially Asia, because if you think about it, in the 1950s and 1960s, countries like Côte d'Ivoire, Korea, and Thailand were pretty much at the same level of development. And there was a major change in Asia that enabled Asia to make huge leaps with 10% growth rates, which led to the changes that we all know. China, from 1978 to now, went from being 20th on world ratings to being the second global power in the world. So I would say that we now have a vision for Africa, because to have strong development, you have to rely on a vision and on strong institutions and people. I think that, in fact, people are at the heart of change. Men and women, I say men, but I mean men and women,